friends. Thanks for joining us on the Equipping You podcast. Our prayer is that this podcast will encourage and equip Alliance pastors and leaders to live spiritually healthy lives and lead their churches well. For more information about the Christ-centered Acts 1-8 Alliance family, visit EquippingU.org.
Hey, welcome back to Equipping You podcast. We're coming to you today from Columbus, Ohio. Did you know this? America's 14th largest city.
I did not know the exact number. I do know it's one of the faster growing cities.
It is growing. Intel is coming. Of course, the Christian Missionary Alliance has come, and that's
I'm sure that made a big difference.
Caused quite the population boom in and of itself.
No doubt.
I'm
14.
Terry, Church Ministries Leader for the Alliance.
I'm Alan, Director of Development for the Eastern PA District of the Alliance.
And today, Alan, our guest is Jen Ashby.
Yeah, Jen.
She's Board of Directors member in the Alliance, an effective communicator of God's Word, and on staff at Metro District.
Yeah, I love that. I love that.
Helping churches. So Jen is also single, and she just written a dissertation as a part of her Doctor of Ministry program to help churches minister well to single adults. Mm-hmm. Not a topic I'm necessarily an expert on, since I got married the week after I graduated from high school.
Yes, I'm aware.
Yeah, so I'm looking forward to the conversation and what kind of insights Jen has to share with us.
I'm sure they will be good because Jen is a thoughtful and deliberate person.
She is, very much so. So grab yourself a purple papaya iced tea. Sit back, relax. Here we go. And we're pleased to welcome to Equipping You podcast, Jen Ashby, my good friend. Jen, welcome. Good to have you with us.
Thank you. Great to be here. Thanks for the opportunity.
Yeah, we're happy to have you.
So we like to allow our listeners to get to know our guests a bit. So if you would, please give us a nutshell version of your bio. Where'd you grow up? When did you come to know Christ? How did you get involved in Alliance ministry?
Yeah, I grew up in South Central Kansas in a very small town. And as a little girl, I was very much a planner. I planned my wedding. I planned the architectural drawings for the house I would live in. I was going to be a teacher, and I made lesson plans. So spoiler alert, none of those things happened, but I had plans. and I was raised in a Christian home and grew up in the church. I always knew God was real. God loved me. But I did know that there was some kind of disconnect between me and God. And it wasn't until I was 12 at my first youth group camp experience that the speaker used that bridge to life illustration with God on one side and people on the other, and sin, that gulf in between. That's really what the Spirit used to say, that's the disconnect that you've been feeling. And so that was a day when things kind of came together for me, and I put my trust in Jesus initially. I think in my young mind, the little planner in me unconsciously thought, well, there's a Christian plan for life. And if I work the plan, everything will go just as I hope and dream. And so I did that for about 10 years or so. And by and large, that was my experience. But then when I was 22, a number of things happened almost simultaneously. A romantic relationship ended. My dad died of cancer the weekend of my college graduation. And you know what it's like when you go through college with a giant cohort of people and then you're done and they scatter. And my mom moved from the place I grew up in within about 2 months of that. And some of the people and places I thought would be part of my life for a long time suddenly were not there. And it was really a recalibration, coming to the end of myself kind of time. So 12 and 22 were two really significant times for me spiritually. Yeah. And then not long after that, I was working as an occupational therapist and moved from Kansas up to Pennsylvania. Got
Yay.
in, yeah,
Yeah,
Western
yeah.
Pennsylvania, and started attending Oil City Community Alliance Church under the leadership of Brad Sickler, and got very involved there, was leading youth ministry and on the board, and started a young adult ministry. And one day Brad stopped me as I was leaving the building and said, "Jen, have you ever thought about going into ministry? Because you kind of already think this way." And I said, "Well, yeah, actually, plan A had been to get married and go on staff with Campus Crusade, now known as Cru, but that hadn't come to fruition." And so that's when I began to take really substantial steps towards joining that staff part-time and getting licensed, et cetera. So I've been part of the Alliance ever since.
That is pretty cool.
That is
I
cool.
definitely did not know the Brad Sickler connection there, and he's still serving faithfully in Western PA, but in the bottom half of the state, not the top half.
That's right.
Yeah, that's good.
Right.
Yep, he's a good man.
Yeah.
So, who are 2 or 3 leaders who have had the greatest influence and impact on your life and ministry?
Yeah, probably right at the top of the list are Doug and Julie Conley, some more Alliance people that I met during my time in Western PA, and then Doug was serving at a different church in Maryland right about the time I finished my seminary degree. And so, with my new seminary degree in hand, I was not able to find a full-time job in the Alliance. And so, um, uh, Doug said to me, "Jen, Julie and I will be so happy for you if God provides a way for you to serve full time. But if He doesn't, we would love for you to come and be part of what God is doing at our church, Durwood Alliance Church in Rockville, Maryland, which is now called Neighborhood Church." And so, with my new seminary degree, I got an OT job in Maryland. and became part of that community. But I ended up serving there for 16 years. The first 8 or so were with Doug, and Doug and Julie are dear friends. And I just learned a ton from Doug in terms of ministry. The second person, shorter story, is Richard Bush.
Yeah.
Oh,
So,
wow.
I was very influenced by Richard's ministry of Life on Life formation. And God really used him to show me a lot of things about spiritual formation and how contemplative life can really be part of life in ministry. So life-changing experience. I'm so thankful.
Yeah, that's the second time I believe that Richard Bush has been the answer to that question. I believe that was Tom Flanders' answer as well, wasn't it?
I think that's true.
Wow.
I do believe that's true.
Wow, that's great. We love that question, and I'm glad you shared those stories with us. Thanks for doing that.
So, Jen, you completed your D-Min a few months ago. Congratulations.
Thank you.
And the title of your dissertation is the local church practices that increase or decrease the inclusion of single adults in the congregation. So what drew you to study that particular topic?
Yeah, I'm passionate about the health and effectiveness of local churches. And part of that for me has to do with the full inclusion of people from what I would call non-dominant groups. And you can have all kinds of non-dominant groups. But I think one of those is single adults. When you look at the statistics of society in the U.S., singleness is on the rise. The last census says over 48% of adults in the U.S. are single. But when we look in our churches, those numbers are harder to find, but they're reported as low as 23% of the adults in our churches are single. And so from my perspective, anytime we see a significant gap between who's in our society and who's in our churches, it raises some missiological questions for us that warrant some exploration. Are we not reaching folks or retaining folks? What's under there? And there's not as much research and work in this area as one might hope. So I felt like it was an area where I might be able to make a contribution.
That's fantastic. I appreciate that. And I think that's a struggling point for a lot of pastors, trying to make that connection there and to care for that group and to reach that group. But we'd be interested in hearing some of your experiences that discovered you as a single woman in that. I mean, I'm assuming, I could be wrong, but I'm assuming that shapes how you see that and have experienced that firsthand.
Sure. Yeah, I am single, never married, and I don't have any kids. And I just turned 50 this fall.
Woo! Congrats.
Happy birthday.
Thank you.
50s are a
So
great decade. Really, they are.
I'm excited. So I have a lot of experience being a single adult and a lot of experience being a single adult in the church. And in terms of what has been challenging with that, I would say um, some of those things that were challenging were kind of unique to my younger years when that desire and expectation to get married was still very, very strong for me. And a lot of my peers were getting married at that time. And one of the messages that was not helpful coming from some Christians and some Christian contexts was when folks would pull out of context verses like Psalm 37:4, delight in the Lord, he'll give you the desires of your heart. So some of those kinds of messages that seemed to imply that I wasn't getting what I desired or wanted because there was something wrong with my relationship with God. Not helpful. Another message that wasn't just unhelpful at that time, but even today, even very recently, I still see this come up a lot, is the message from some Christians or some churches along the lines of you don't really become sanctified until you get married, or the best way to get sanctified is to get married. And I think when I hear folks say those things, or I notice that they like those memes on social media, I think they're often just speaking from their own experience that marriage is something that God has really used in their lives to form them into Christ likeness. And that's a totally valid experience. But I think to put that out there as the universal, this is the way to walk with Jesus, this is the way to become like Jesus, isn't biblical and isn't really helpful. So those kinds of messages that imply singleness means there's a problem with my relationship with God, or there's a problem with my walk with God or becoming like God, that sort of thing is not very helpful. And the last thing I would just say in general is church contexts where there's a lot of language and celebrations and activities, etc., around marriage and childbearing without also having those for people who don't fit that mold. So sometimes it isn't things that are said or done, it's the silence that speaks volumes. When we say and do a lot in regards to one group and are silent about the other group, that sends a message. But on the plus side, I mean, I've also been really blessed to know Christians and be part of Christian contexts that have a really healthy, like, both and approach. Yes, we have a high view of marriage and we want to celebrate things around that, but we also have a high view of singleness, and we also celebrate other kinds of life events and circumstances. I've had a lot of good experiences just having healthy relationships with Christians in the church and outside of the church. And I think that the other positive thing for me that has emerged over time is really just using my own agency to have my own healthy life and to respectfully give feedback in these areas and be able to bring positive influence in these areas. Just like coming around to this idea that I don't need to wait for invitations. I can extend hospitality. I can broker relationships with singles and help singles make other relationships with marrieds and singles in the church. So again, it's been a mixed bag. There's been some things that are challenging and not helpful, but there's also been some healthy things that I've experienced. I'm really grateful for.
So I'm curious. I wrestle with these things sometimes with giving snarky comebacks that get me in trouble. Have you ever felt the temptation, one of those moments to say, when people are kind of misquoting scripture to you, to say, I don't know, how do you feel about the Apostle Paul preferring you remain single? Like I would feel like I would be so tempted to say that to people when they take scriptures out of context. Oh my goodness.
I could tell you I'm tempted at times. Yes.
I would hope I would keep my mouth shut, but I definitely know I would be tempted if I was in that situation, because he has some strong language on that preference, and the value of pleasing the Lord.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Just read it the other day.
Yeah.
So Jen, you wrote a shorter article out of your dissertation that I had the opportunity to read. And in that, you make the excellent point that we cannot build strong practices on weak theology. So if you would, please give us an overview of a theology of singleness and where we might go in Scripture to help shape such a theology.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, at a really high level, I'd say, clearly in Old Testament, we can see that marriage and childbearing was a significant part of the Abrahamic covenant, right? From Genesis. And we see that theme through the scriptures. And we're also have to keep in mind that in both Old and New Testament times and beyond, choosing singleness or childlessness as an option wasn't feasible for the vast majority of people, just because of the way social and economic constructs existed. So we have certainly this foundation of seeing marriage and childbearing as part of God's covenant and a big part of social and economic realities in the Old Testament. But even in the Old Testament, we can see some prophetic pieces in Isaiah, such as Isaiah 54 begins to foreshadow a time when marriage and childbearing isn't going to be quite so prominent. It talks about the barren woman who's rejoicing. And then a couple chapters later, Isaiah 56 talks about a eunuch who would be serving in the temple and would be honored and blessed for that. And that would be a real contrast from Deuteronomy 23, where eunuchs are not permitted to serve in the temple. So in the Old Testament, we have this strong foundation, including marriage and childbearing, but we're beginning to see this foreshadowing of a shift. And then I think in the New Testament, we start to see a bit of a movement from an emphasis on be fruitful, multiply, fill the earth, biological heirs, to go and make disciples of all nations, spiritual heirs. We begin to see a bit of a shift in emphasis there. And then we have Jesus on the scene, who lived a single life, who modeled singleness, who made several statements about the family of believers as even a higher priority than the nuclear family. For example, in Matthew 12, when he says, who are my mother and my brothers? These are my mother and brothers. Or Luke 14, when he says, unless you hate your mother, father, wife, and children, you can't be my disciple. So there is this very high priority, high value on the household of God, the family of God. Jesus says in Matthew 19, he's talking about eunuchs, saying, some are born this way as eunuchs, some are made this way by others, and some choose this for the sake of the kingdom. And he says, the one who can accept this should. That's Matthew 19. And then in Matthew 22, Jesus talks about at the resurrection, no one will be married or given in marriage. So Jesus, while he certainly honors and affirms and elevates marriage and family, he also models and affirms this idea of singleness. And then, of course, we have Paul, the Apostle Paul, who modeled singleness, and probably the most well-known passage on singleness he wrote in 1 Corinthians 7 about some of those advantages. So that is very high-level overview of basic theology of singleness and how we see that through the scriptures. I really recommend Barry Danilak's book, Redeeming Singleness, for a really good exploration of that. And then Daniel Treweek, just this year, came out with a book called The Meaning of Singleness that also talks about theology, but also how this has been viewed through church history. So a couple of great resources that are available.
Excellent. Yeah. Perhaps our faithful assistant, Isaac, could put those in the show notes for us so that our listeners can find those later. That's good. I appreciate those recommendations. Awesome. That'd be great. Awesome. So your studies revealed practices that impact the inclusion of single adults in the church. So let's start with the negative side first and kind of get those out of the way. And hopefully we can be honest when we are guilty of those. What are the negative church practices that decrease the inclusion of single adults?
Yeah, based on the single adults in churches that I interviewed, the number one thing by far that decreases inclusion is the underrepresentation of singleness in sermons. So by that, I mean both uh, the underrepresentation in terms of what we actually teach on. All of these participants could say, I've heard multiple sermons on the topic of marriage. But when you ask them, have you ever heard a sermon on the topic of singleness? They would either say no, or they would say, yeah, that time you came to our church and talked about that.
Yeah.
So there's that side of it. But then there's also the side of just like illustrations and applications, regardless of what the text is or what the topic is, that oftentimes the preacher is married, and oftentimes he or she is speaking from their own experience naturally. And so most or all of the illustrations and applications are examples coming from married life. So it's both of I'm referring to both of those things when I say it's that underrepresentation of singleness in sermons. That's the leading thing that decreases inclusion. A couple other things for the younger singles, for people under 45. I'm defining younger as quite broad there, but that's how it broke out with the data. So younger singles, to be included in the church or to feel included in the church, they're not so much concerned with connecting with other single people, but they are concerned about connecting with other people their own age. So whether it's in the whole congregation or it's in a class or a small group or on a team, young adults who are single just don't want to be the only young adult in that context. It doesn't have to be a group entirely of young adults. In fact, a lot of these young adults really want that intergenerational experience, but they don't want to be the only one their age in that situation. And then for the older single adults, for about half of them, so not all, but for about half, those over 45 said what decreases inclusion for them is that when they're in a setting like a small group or a class, et cetera, at church, to be the only single in the group with all couples, for half of them, that was difficult. But even adding one more single adult to that mix lowers or eradicates that discomfort. So the younger singles just want somebody else in the mix their age. The older singles just want somebody else in the mix who's also single.
Helpful. So flip the page, Jen, and talk about which church practices increase the inclusion of single adults.
Yeah. So by far across the board, for all these singles, younger, older, male, female, etc., it's positive relationships. It's having positive personal relationships with other people in the church. Not only the things that get programmed or driven by church leadership, but also that organic life together that individuals initiate, so that there's time together in each other's homes or doing social things or communication, even texts make a huge difference in having personal relationships. That was by far the strongest thing. And then a couple other things in that category that increase inclusion. It's participation in small groups, which is where those relationships are more likely to be formed, or serving on a ministry team. Again, partly because it creates opportunity for those positive relationships. And then finally, something that increases inclusion for adults is many of them expressed great appreciation for being acknowledged in some way, shape, or form in the worship service. So that's everything from if the church has different people reading scriptures to occasionally have one of those people be single. Or if the church various times has people give testimonies, to sometimes have a single adult giving testimony. It can even be as a group. People referred to, everybody on my team was asked to stand up and was sort of cheered on for what we're doing together. And even though their name wasn't called, even though they didn't go down front, there was something about being acknowledged in the worship service that was really meaningful for them. So those were the primary findings of the study.
Great.
So, one of the interesting stats from your studies was about churches having targeted single adult ministry. Your study said that 31% said they would, 31% said they might, and 37% say they would not participate. But I guess we would probably think, maybe we shouldn't think this way, but we'd expect a high percentage to be excited about such a ministry. Help us understand what's behind these stats in terms of the perception of adult singles.
Yeah. Well, I'm old enough to remember that a couple decades ago, singles ministry was all the rage. So churches got a lot of pressure and push to have like an ongoing targeted singles adult ministry, or maybe more than one. Or if your church isn't big enough to do one, maybe you should partner with other churches. It was very, very popular. And now there is much, much less of that happening. And the general sentiment tends to be along these lines. A lot of people in my study, as well as what I'm seeing in the literature review, are not really interested in being pigeonholed or like diverted to another group because they experience that as being treated as the other. They are much more interested in being integrated with the rest of the body. They have friends who are married and friends who are single, and they have friends of all ages. And so they're just less interested in being, some perceive that not as being celebrated, but sort of as being set aside is kind of the perception. And then for some, whether a singles ministry really is this way or not, place to place, it is perceived as a matchmaking group. So it is perceived as a place you go to find a partner. And not all single adults are looking for a partner. And even those who are looking for a partner don't necessarily want to do it in that context. So that's a piece of it as well. But again, not everyone feels the same way. And that's why you have that a third in that data.
Yeah, that's so interesting. Our city had one of those regional kind of singles ministries that a lot of churches, kind of contributed money to help it work together. But I think its chief demise was the fact that it became known as a matchmaking place. And then the people that weren't interested in that didn't want to be part of that. And so the whole thing started to unravel. So that's very good insight. I appreciate you sharing that with us.
Yeah.
So Jen, talk to our listeners about some issues relevant to single adults and how they would like to see their churches address these issues.
Yeah, about half the adults that I interviewed ended up sharing in an unsolicited way, because I didn't have targeted questions about this, issues that they wish they had a space to talk about at church, or that they could get some discipling in or equipping in. And those issues kind of fell into three categories. One category had to do with dating. They have questions about, the people I interviewed had questions about dating non-Christians, dating after divorce, dating after the death of a spouse. Another category I called contentment, maybe a better word for it, but things like understanding why one is single, knowing what to do as a single, dealing with desire and loneliness, those kinds of things. And then the other category is sex. So things came up about celibacy, pornography, masturbation, LGBTQ plus dynamics. And as I was listening to people express this, particularly some of the younger adults, at one point I said to one of these participants, I said, so I think I hear you saying you wish there was a space in church where you could be talking these things through, but there isn't. So since there isn't, where do you go for information about this? And this young person said, well, I Google and I look at social media. And the next young person who told me a lot of the same things, I asked the same question, and he said, well, I asked my friends. Some of them are Christians, some of them aren't. And so as a church leader, I'm thinking, we probably shouldn't leave this to Google. These are important discipleship topics we need to find a way to lean in on. So I think there's a lot of work to do in terms of figuring out in general and then church by church per context, how do we create those spaces for conversation and discipling and equipping? Especially because the feedback about singles ministry is so mixed. So there's some work to do there.
Yeah, for sure.
So, I mean, you've given us some really good insights on a lot of levels, but if a pastor or a church leader listening to this right now just says, well, just give me one thing I can do to help move us in the right direction. Just what would be that one thing to say, focus on this and you'll get some traction?
Yeah. I think that every church, if they don't already have this, needs to have at least a couple people who are single adults who are speaking into periodically the planning and the feedback process for that church. And the pastor or whoever's leading there needs to expressly tell them, we want to grow in our ability to have healthy inclusion of both married and single people. And we're asking for your input with planning and feedback on how things go. Because many of our church leaders, this is a whole other conversation, but many of our church leaders are married. And whether we're married or single, we all have blind spots and we can't see what we can't see. And so I think inviting somebody in, I don't expect single leaders to understand everything about everybody or married leaders to understand everything about everybody, but increasing that diversity in terms of who's doing the planning and who's doing the feedback will help. So that single adult or adults can say, I see we have a 6-week sermon series on marriage planned for this year. Maybe you would consider moving that important conversation to a different format, like a weekend retreat, and keeping our Sunday morning worship services for a more general audience. Or that single person is looking at planning and might be able to say, maybe we could consider one of the weeks of Advent having a single person or a couple single people coming up and lighting those Advent candles to sort of round out the optics and the representation of who's up front and participating in that. So if there's just one thing that a church leader, pastor is going to do, the one thing, it's kind of like you're saying, what's my one wish? I'm choosing a wish that will give me 1,000 wishes. It's to have a couple single adults who can respectfully, in a constructive, healthy, helpful way, help them see the bigger picture.
That's great counsel.
That's good. That's really good, helpful advice.
Jen, you've given us a lot of great insights today, and we really appreciate it. Appreciate your willingness to share in this area out of your own experience and expertise.
Yeah.
So much appreciation for taking the time to be with us today.
Thank you for having me. I did not want this study to just be an academic exercise. So I'm grateful for the opportunity to get the message out. Thank you.
All right.
Very helpful. Thank you. As promised, Alan, Jen gave us some great insights on how the church can minister well to single people. What stood out to you as you listened to some of what Jen had to say?
Well, as anticipated, and it was thoughtful and deliberate. I noted, and with her on the off-air conversation afterwards, that I do believe a lot of our pastors try to do good things for single adults with good intentions, not realizing that they're actually hindering their inclusion in the body because they're being singled out,
Yeah.
as opposed to being included in the life of the body. So I thought she framed that well. Honestly, I know it was a big deal to her to make sure that she wasn't saying that the church, celebrating marriage and children is a bad thing. I think
No.
she's saying, no, we just need to raise the value of singleness, because
Right.
those people are a treasure to the church as well.
So we really hope this and every episode of Equipping You
Every
podcast
single one.
is helpful to you. And as you lead in your local church, next time we'll have Marvin Newell, who will talk about those without gospel access. We look forward to that
It's gonna be a good one.
conversation. Important conversation for those of us who are part of the Alliance, the heartbeat of why we do what we do. So please tell others about this episode. Invite them to watch and listen to the next episode. Meanwhile, keep the faith.
Thanks for joining us on this episode of the Equipping You podcast. If you liked this episode, please consider subscribing and sharing it with a friend. For more information about this podcast and other ministries of the Alliance, visit equippingu.org.